it's a very interesting question that you could have a congenital disorder of reading, because reading, after all, is a supreme cultural activity. It's something that hasn't been around for more than about, 5,000 years at the very most, and then of course it's been around as a pretty universal skill only for about 100 years, if that. So it's really astonishing to think that the brain has something to do with it, because the brain, in terms of its long evolution, cannot have been built in order to read in the way we read. So reading is something that capitalizes on something else that the brain is very good at and has evolved over millions and millions of years. And this is speech and language, because the text that we read is, of course, visible language, but it is language. And this was a very deep insight, I think, that came to people who thought about what is necessary in order to read. So at the very beginning, when I started to be interested in reading and reading difficulties, there was a very strong ideology that dyslexia didn't exist at all. It wasn't to be taken as a brain-based condition, but it was something that was completely artificial, that was perhaps a result of lack of interest, that was perhaps a result of bad teaching, or it was actually something that middle-class parents would like to invent for their children if they didn't succeed at school, because they couldn't possibly think that ordinary intelligent children couldn't learn to read and spell. Now I thought, yes, very intelligent children may fail to learn to read and spell for some very, very specific reason, for the kind of reason that makes it also impossible for adults after brain damage to read and spell. Now, the question was, what was it? What should one be looking at? And I think the first idea that seemed very tempting, because after all, reading is a very visual activity, that one should think of it possibly as a visual disorder. It took, I think, Maggie Snowling, who came to me as my first PhD student and was extremely interested in understanding dyslexia, to really come to this insight with her work, with her experience and her experiments, that the problem is actually one of hearing rather than of seeing, and not hearing in general, but hearing and saying little speech sounds that map onto letters. So we have the code of sound to letter, which is so central for the alphabetic writing system, which is difficult to grasp for some people, and these are the dyslexics. A phonological deficit is really still a pretty vague term to indicate some kind of problem in the speech processing system. And phonology is really a way of combining speech sounds in different ways. This is what the letters of the alphabet capitalize on. It's not something that we are aware of, that we just speak without thinking about it. It's one continuous stream of words. But actually there are all these little speech sounds that have to be accessed very quickly, and we only are aware sometimes when we make mistakes that there are very, very complicated processes at work. And in dyslexics, these processes are not working as well as others. So this is what we were trying to investigate, especially with adults, with adult dyslexics who had, in fact, learned to read and write very well. Many of them compensated excessively well, so that if you gave them a reading test and a spelling test, they would come out as perfectly fine, as average for the population. These were people who were actually university students. And many people would have said, we cannot call them dyslexic any longer, because by the criteria of a reading and spelling test, they are not really abnormally inaccurate or don't have the ability as other children. But we believed, of course, that their speech processing would still show these problems even when they had compensated for the other difficulties. And the kinds of tests that we came up with for the adults has something to do with manipulating speech sounds in the head. So, for example, there is a test of spoonerisms. So this is a very easy thing to do. You have two words and you have to swap the beginning sound of each word and put it in a different place. So you have lemon basket and you make lemon lasket out of this. So we had a little test like this. For example, it started with John Lennon, Lon Jenon, Helen Mirren, Melon Heron, Kylie Minogue, Miley Kinogue. This kind of test shows remarkably well when people have difficulties in manipulating speech sounds. So dyslexics find this really hard. They take a long time to think over this. And other people can do it absolutely very, very fast. So it's a question of how many can you get correct in 1 minute, for example. The very severe dyslexics can't do the test at all. This is just one of a whole battery of tests that have to do with speech sound manipulation.